we can now be more or less certain that there are going to be a number of horrific murders taking place every year in the United States. This is fundamentally a problem of judges, just as it is a problem of criminals on the street. These individuals with extensive criminal records, they should be in prison or they should be institutionalized, and yet they are not, simply because Americans living in our major cities are well aware of the crisis that continues to afflict our subway systems and public transportation. And Americans outside of the cities are aware of this as well. How could they not be, considering some of the horrific stories that have broken only in the past year? So just a month ago, a woman was attacked and set alight on the Blue Line in Chicago. In the summer, of course, Irena was murdered on a commuter train in the area of Charlotte, North Carolina. And then around this time last year, in December of 2024, a woman named Debrina Kawam was set on fire in the New York City subway and killed. These sorts of attacks are happening with such regularity that we should think of them as being more or less predictable. Not that any of these three women who were attacked in the incidents I've just mentioned had any enemies, had any reason to suspect that their lives were in danger. They were regular commuters, and yet their lives were either fundamentally changed or ended outright by random attacks from strangers who decided to set them on fire or plunge a knife into their necks. Now, an ordinary commuter who goes, to work every day in New York City or in Washington, D.C., or in any number of other places in America is obviously not going to encounter murderous violence. But there's always the potential for this violence to break out. And if you are a regular commuter in most of America's cities, sooner or later you will encounter insanity, you will encounter aggressive behavior, you may even encounter the threat of violence or actual violence. And when I say that it's predictable and in some sense even routine to have these kinds of crimes, it's because they do happen at a certain interval that we can now more or less be assured of. We can now be more or less certain that there are going to be a number of horrific murders taking place on our subways and on our commuter transit systems every year in the United States. And why is this? Well, you can look at the profile of these killers and these attackers, and they usually have something in common. They almost always have extensive criminal records, and yet they have been released by judges not only to walk the streets, but also to stalk the subways, where their victims usually are not able to escape them very easily. These individuals with extensive criminal records, in many cases they also have shown signs of mental instability. They should be in prison or they should be institutionalized, and yet they are not, simply because a judge's discretion has decided to turn them loose and set them free to go and prey upon innocent women. The problem here, in other words, is twofold. It's not only the criminals who are committing these crimes, but also the judges who are failing to put these criminals behind bars or in mental institutions once it becomes clear much earlier on that these people are already a danger to society and are not capable of reforming and behaving in a way that does not pose a threat to their fellow citizens. The judges are the ones who have, in some ways, even greater responsibility for what happens here. Obviously not the immediate responsibility for the murders and for the attacks on individuals in the subway systems, but responsibility because they are more responsible public figures. Judges are meant to have a high degree of responsibility to the public and a responsibility to judge correctly, to use prudence in a wise way. And instead, we see whole generations of judges now who instead have a very soft-on-crime attitude and are turning out onto the streets people who pose a real threat to their fellow citizens. If we want to stop this, we not only have to be more aware of the criminals who are circulating among us, but we also have to be aware fundamentally of the judges who let them circulate. And if the judges are not changed, if their attitude does not change, if the judges, in terms of personnel, are not replaced by other judges who are going to be more serious in their approach to crime, you're going to have this problem continue and perhaps even escalate. So this is fundamentally a problem of judges, just as it is a problem of criminals on the street. Now, in a few places, you are seeing measures taken by state legislatures and other officials to try to redress this problem. So North Carolina, for example, has now passed Irena's law, and it's come into effect. And this is a law that tries to make sure that individuals like the one who killed Irena are not able to get out, from a lax judicial process and one that is much too complacent towards criminals and much too complacent towards the lives of innocent victims like Irena. So Irena Irena's law now specifies more mental testing for people who may be suspected of being highly disturbed. It limits the ability of judges to be able to release people on their own cognition, and it also gets rid of certain forms of cashless bail. Now, cashless bail has been a recent trend that progressives have been supporting, where they basically say that when you arrest someone, they're charged with a crime, perhaps even a quite serious crime, but rather than being held or being charged a surety, a bond, in order to prove that they will not go out and be a danger to their fellow citizens, in order to show that they will actually appear for their court dates. Rather than having that system, they're simply let loose as soon as they are arrested because you don't want to put any kind of burden on potential criminals where they would have to produce cash in order to be granted a surety that they will not be, skipping their court dates and going out and continuing to cause mayhem. So Irena's law has a lot of common sense provisions, and it's a law that should be replicated in other states. The law also is attempting to restore the death penalty in North Carolina. Now, you might be surprised to hear this. If you know anything about North Carolina law, you should know that North Carolina is indeed a rather conservative state that has the death penalty. So why is it that there would be a need for Irena's law to restore the death penalty? Well, it's because ever since the year 2006, the death penalty has been blocked in North Carolina. Its application has been prevented by a series of lawsuits and judicial rulings concerning the justice of both the system itself and also lethal injection as a particular process. There have been a whole number of objections mounted in the courts which have tried to prevent the due and just operation of capital punishment in North Carolina. And all of those court cases, all of those legal attempts to tie down the law have succeeded. They've prevented any execution from taking place in North Carolina for almost 20 years. Irena's law is going to try to change that and is going to try to make sure that the death penalty can be applied the way that voters intended and the way that lawmakers intended. We will see, of course, whether or not Irena's law itself stands up to the legal challenges that progressives are sure to mount to it. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and if you're enjoying this podcast, please hit the like button and also share this with your friends and with your relatives. It's the holiday season, and anyone you think might benefit from an intelligent, conservative commentary, both reflecting on today's news, but also looking back, in many cases, philosophically at the roots of American conservative thought. Modern Age as a podcast is for them, and so is Modern Age as a website, www.modernAgeJournal.com. Again, that's www.modernAgeJournal.com. That's our website where you will find new content every workday, which partly is drawn from our archives, which go all the way back to 1957. Some of the most brilliant conservative minds and most brilliant conservative essays that have been published in more than 60 years will be found in our archive, and we represent material on our website. We also have newly commissioned articles, both on today's issues and on, sort of the great principles of conservative philosophy. You can also find Modern Age in print. It comes out quarterly, every 3 months, and there too you will find incisive material in a beautifully elegant package every 3 months. Thank you for watching the Modern Age podcast with Dan McCarthy. Now, it's important to keep in mind, some states do have elected judges, and so the public can directly express how they feel about judges who take a soft-on-crime attitude. Other places may not have elected judges, but of course, in those places, judges are appointed, usually by politicians, and the politicians do have to answer to voters and do have to be responsible to what the public says about crime. Now, the key question here is going to be whether voters are aware of what their politicians are actually doing when they appoint either liberal justices, progressive judges, or judges who are simply complacent and go along with the generally leftward trend of the legal profession in recent years, a trend towards more accommodation of criminals and less compassion for their victims. It's necessary for the public to put pressure on politicians to appoint only judges who are going to be very strict in the application of the law and who are going to address some of these crimes that have been so horrific in the past year, and indeed who are going to address the potential for crime to start rising again. We saw an enormous boost in crime rates, including violent crime, in 2020 amid the riots following the death of George Floyd. And at any moment, it seems as if that kind of violence can return. In many of our cities, of course, it never went away, and it continues to be very elevated. It's necessary to have judges who are going to enforce the law, who are going to apply it strictly, and who are not going to take the side of the criminals who have extensive records of doing harm to their fellow citizens, and who, if they are let loose to continue with that kind of track record, will only escalate eventually to committing mayhem and ultimately perhaps even murder. So there's a great political problem that is facing the country right now. It is that voters, often are not aware of just how complacent politicians are in the judges they appoint, and then in turn, how the judges in many cases have sympathy more for perpetrators than they do for victims. This is an indictment of our legal culture. And one of the things that's worth noting here, a few years ago, especially in 2020, you saw that progressives actually made open and public campaigns in politics to try to defund the police, to try to abolish bail, to try to take any number of steps that would reduce the ability of law enforcement officers to fight crime and to prevent the kinds of mayhem that we've seen on our public transportation systems and on the streets of our cities. This was an open and public campaign to try to reduce the powers of law enforcement and try to increase the privileges of criminals. And of course, whenever this became a matter that the public was asked to comment on directly, whenever the public was given a choice to vote on whether they wanted to defund the police, they typically would not do it. Voters are, they're not necessarily strongly conservative, but they're also not necessarily strongly progressive. And so when they're presented with something as ridiculous as defunding the police, moving the money instead into social workers, or abolishing bail altogether, so again, people who are arrested and accused of various, quite serious crimes are simply let go, practically the same day. Voters don't like that. Voters don't go for it. But progressives know that they don't have to depend on voters taking their side. Progressives know that the ballot box is only one of the places where they have to fight their battles, and it's not even the most important place for progressives to fight their battles. Because what progressives are very adept at doing is basically changing the culture of law and justice in America through the law schools, through higher education, through the media and the way the media reports on law enforcement and on crime. Basically, you'll notice that media for more than 10 years now has tended to focus on anything that happens that involves police having to kill a perpetrator. Anything that involves police violence will get an enormous amount of attention from the mass media, whereas the things that violent criminals do often do not get remarked upon at all, or at least do not get sufficient attention. For example, in this horrific case of Irena, who was murdered, again, on a train near Charlotte, North Carolina, it took weeks, basically, for some of the mainstream media outlets that you would expect to cover such a sensational story to actually take notice and start to report on it in full. It was something they seemed quite reluctant to do, whereas you can imagine that if we had a story like, for example, Daniel Penny, the, military veteran who took vigilante action to make sure that people were safe on a New York subway car when a homeless man was threatening them. Daniel Penny became an overnight sensation. The media was, covering that story, with great enthusiasm and zeal. And of course, they were painting Daniel Penny as the oppressor. They were painting him as, the real threat. That basically the person who was threatening the passengers on this train car. That criminal was not really the problem. Daniel Penny, in preventing that criminal and causing his death, Daniel Penny was the one who was vilified for that. So both law enforcement officers and individuals like Daniel Penny are targets of media smear campaigns and criticism, whereas many of the criminals who are going out and committing egregious acts of mayhem and even murder on our city streets are relatively little covered. Now, you could say perhaps it's because, this is common enough that it's not really news. But of course, many of these crimes are so horrific in their detail that they really are things that ought to be not only news, but really news for weeks at a time, things that should really cause national reflection. Now, think about this. Back in the 1960s, there was a woman who was raped and murdered outside of her apartment building named Kitty Genovese. And she became a kind of cause celeb because the question was, why did no one else in her apartment building who could presumably hear her screams or perhaps even see what was being done to her, why did no one intervene to try to help and save her? This was something that the New York Times made an ongoing series of columns and news articles calling attention and basically asking the question, has America become a heartless and a callous society that does not intervene to save the life of a woman who's being raped and murdered? Well, think about the murder of Irena this summer. Now, she was murdered on a train that had many passengers on it. It took minutes before anyone tried to help her after she had been stabbed 3 times by this attacker. And at that point, it was already too late. She was bleeding to death. No one on the train tried to, at first, apprehend the attacker. Even though there were able-bodied men, there were other people on that train who potentially could have interfered and saved Irena's life, or at least tried to take the perpetrator down. If this had been decades ago, this should have been a story that required as much, deserved as much attention and acquired as much attention as Kitty Genovese's slaying. Instead, however, that was not the case. This time it was treated as kind of an embarrassment that the national media had to cover this story at all. And there have been any number of other horrific incidents as well. So I mentioned the terrible case of Irena Kawam, which happened in December of 2024. And it was an illegal alien from Guatemala who set her on fire and killed her. This is a human being burned alive in the subway system of our greatest and largest city, New York City. And yet, even though it did get plenty of media attention, the attention really, didn't treat this as something that should never ever happen in our cities, in our country, and that this is something that should cause us to reflect very seriously on what kinds of people some of these illegal immigrants are. Now, clearly, there is a role for federal law enforcement in cracking down on illegal immigration to make sure that individuals like the perpetrator of that crime are not in this country to begin with, and therefore they cannot burn alive someone like Irena Kawam. But all across the board, there is a need for the media to take these incidents much more seriously. And of course, if the media is not going to do it, if the mainstream media isn't going to do it, then there has to be other channels by which the American public is informed of what's happening and is informed of the need to have judges who take these criminal acts much more seriously and are dedicated to applying the law strictly enough to prevent them from happening in the first place. It's not enough simply to say that you're going to get these criminals after they've committed murder, after they burned someone alive. No, they should be stopped once they've acquired a criminal record earlier on in their careers. They should be taken out of society permanently, put either in prison, or if it seems as if they are so mentally disturbed that they are not responsible or fully responsible for their actions, they should be institutionalized on a more or less permanent basis. And that should be involuntary commitment, which is one of the things Irena's law thankfully brings back. It makes it easier to involuntarily commit disturbed individuals who might be violent and might commit acts of acts of a criminal nature against their fellow citizens. So we're seeing some move in the right direction in the state of North Carolina, and hopefully that will act as a model to other states to enact things like Irena's law. We do need to see in states that elect judges that the public takes very seriously the possibility that this could happen anywhere. This happens in New York City, this happens in Chicago, this happens in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it can happen in different ways in practically any major city in America and in many of our smaller cities and towns as well. So take it very seriously. This is not something that is so epocally rare, something that only occurs, once a generation, that we can afford to think that this is just, a kind of a feature that occasionally pops up but is not a consistent problem. No, this is something that is happening now multiple times in a given year, such as the past one. I am hopeful that Americans do realize the horror of these crimes and that they are preventable crimes. They are predictable and preventable precisely because we know the criminal records that these individuals who are perpetrating these crimes have, and we know that if judges are dedicated to taking the law more seriously and to having more compassion for victims, they can act to prevent these individuals, these criminals, from getting out on the streets, getting into the subways, and taking advantage of commuters, murdering innocent women. This can all be stopped if only we take the law much more seriously and insist that judges themselves also take the law with utmost gravity.